Hello and welcome to another edition of Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of our election law program, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Tony Goggin, who's a visiting faculty expert here at Ohio State this fall, helping with our election coverage and activities and teaching our election law course, visiting, of course, from Drake University. And also joining our podcast today is Terry Enns, a senior fellow of our election law program at Ohio State, who this fall is actually visiting at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and is coming to us today from Las Vegas. And, you know, we also, I think, yes, have Ann Ralph, who's just been able to join us as well, another one of the election law at Ohio State members here with me in Columbus today. So it's great to be with all of you. We're now just over a week out of a week from the week past the election, let me be clear. And last week, at the end of the week, we had a podcast that was a little bit of early reflection on the 2024 election. Now that we've had a little more time, we are continuing to digest election law related things. And Tony, I know one of the things we talked about last week was a kind of question about turnout. And we said last week that it was still a little early to be saying much definitive about turnout because votes were still being counted in a number of places, and in a few places the number of votes yet to be counted was still quite a large number. Now there are still votes being counted, but I think we're getting closer to having a sense of what the turnout's going to look like. And so although Tony, I often ask you to tee up what we should talk about first, I've taken those reins today because I want to have a follow-up on the turnout question. But what do we know now about turnout?
Steve, as of Wednesday, November 13, when we are recording this podcast, over 150 million ballots have been counted. And Donald Trump currently has a little over a 3 million vote lead on Kamala Harris. Obviously, he's already won the presidency based on him having far exceeded 270 electoral votes. But it is interesting that his 3 million vote lead comes against 150 million ballots cast and counted so far. And it looks like our current estimates are there's still 6 to 7 million ballots yet to be counted. So we're going to end up, in all likelihood, somewhere just shy of the 2020 record, which was 158 million ballots and a turnout of about 66%. Let's say we come in around 156.5 million. That would be about a 64% turnout, which is still a very good turnout by historic standards. But there's an interesting feature of this, which
Tony,
is, yes, Steve.
Your microphone got really weak there again. Now it's back. So
okay, yeah, I think I'm just going to. Yeah, I think it for some reason it seems to go out on me if I don't click the audio on and off. For some reason. So I just kind of, as soon as I'm off air, I will go back to clicking it off. But the one thing I was going to add is just this very interesting issue, which is that although turnout overall was really quite good by historic standards, turnout increased in the battleground states, the 7 battleground states, but turnout fell in the 43 states that were not battlegrounds. So in a way, the presidential election was a story of 2 Americas, not a red America and a blue America, but rather a battleground America and a non-battleground America.
So that's really interesting to think about. There are a couple of things there to think about. So, and maybe ultimately it's that 2 different Americas that we really should spend time thinking about. But just in terms of the total raw numbers, I know that just within the last week and even in the last few days, there are some commentators who are, sort of criticizing the Democratic Party for having a lower turnout in the presidential election nationwide this year than in 2020. But, another way that I think some of the political scientists can look at this data, is to see 2020 as an aberrationally large year turnout wise, that it sort of was higher than you would have anticipated based on just the normal growth in the electorate. And that this year is more of a reversion to the mean year in a certain sense, at least when you think about the total participation throughout the nation. And that maybe 2020 is explainable as bringing to the polls more voters than traditionally participate because of the way in which the choice in 2020 was framed up for voters throughout the nation. And that this year, if it's a reversion to the mean, what does that say about, the way in which the choice was framed up? Again, taking the presidential race as what's mainly driving turnout, although there are also ballot issues to be teased out, and to what extent ballot issues in any states drove turnout this year or not. Sometimes we think ballot issues can drive turnout, but I don't really have much of a sense yet at this point that that was true this year. But was it the case this year that at the presidential level, the choice that voters saw, or at least that some voters saw, caused fewer voters to even think that they were going to participate? I don't know. I'm just posing that as a thought question. But then there's the electoral count story and the swing states, and the sense that you're suggesting, Tony, that maybe we reached a point of, sort of saturation this year with many voters, with the point that it was only going to be the swing states that mattered for the presidential contest. And so a lot of voters stayed home in non-swing states.
Yeah, on an experiential level, Ohio for many, many years was a swing state. And so I lived in Ohio with the level of ads. And then slowly we've dropped off being a swing state and now are considered a solidly red state. But as Steve noted, I'm currently in Nevada, which is clearly still a swing state by the amount of ads and presidential candidate visits. And, it trickles down to, there was a very hard fought Senate race that happened here. So it was kind of interesting to be reminded after the sort of ad attrition that we've experienced in Ohio over the last, maybe 10 years, to be back in that full onslaught of ads. And it's incessant. I'm one who goes into the room when the ads come on, so I'm kind of weird that way, but it's really a lot. And it apparently it doesn't depress voter turnout to feel that, onslaught, but it's a lot.
And I wonder to what extent the influence of sort of a state being a swing state, getting more ads and more visits and more action, creating sort of more, there's sort of this there's self-reinforcing cycle there too, that once folks realize that they're in a swing state, they're going to vote more and more energy gets directed there, et cetera. We had a lot of ads in Ohio. We had a really high spend Senate race here. But it sounds like that is not changing. That did not change turnout in Ohio as much as the other swing states in the presidential election saw.
And it is amazing to think that that Senate race in Ohio cost $500 million. Really extraordinary. And of course, reflects how close the partisan divide is in the US Senate, at least was going into the 2020 race. But to have $470 million some dollars spent on a Senate race is really extraordinary, especially when it wasn't even as California with 40 million people. It was playing out in Ohio with 12 million people, still a big state, but not the biggest state in the country. We still saw $500 million spent.
Yeah. Ohio is known for having 3 very expensive media markets. And if you're gonna run in Ohio for statewide, you got to plan to spend a lot of money because of the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati triumvirate of ad spending locations.
It will be interesting to look with a little more fine-grained analysis at maybe some differences between presidential swing states with Senate races and non-swing states with Senate races, and compare those to states that weren't really contested for presidential race or for the Senate race. But I'm still really sort of fascinated by this possibility you raised, Tony, that we might have reached a point with respect to presidential election politics that voters in non-swing states are simply not participating as much. Now, we've often talked about the relationship, or the comparisons, maybe a better word, between electoral college votes and total popular vote. And, we usually make that comparison because of the rare occasions when the popular vote and the electoral college vote don't line up, and see that as a bit of a disconnect. Well, of course, it's not a fair comparison if voters in non-swing states are choosing not to participate. Then what does it matter what the popular vote is? So we've got a little bit of a challenge there in terms of even trying to interpret what all this data can mean.
That's right. And it is interesting that winning the nationwide popular vote, while purely symbolic, still means a lot to the candidates. President-elect Trump clearly thrilled that he's going to end up with more votes than Kamala Harris. And in 2016, it was very important to Hillary Clinton, the losing candidate, that she had won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. And that certainly was something that factored in the Democrats' frustration with the Electoral College outcome. But Steve, I think the point you make is a huge one, which is we're not seeing the actual turnout we would experience if the presidency was determined by a nationwide popular vote, as opposed to an electoral college, as opposed to the electoral college system. If we had a nationwide popular vote to elect the president, presumably we would see turnout far in excess of 158 million, which is really something to contemplate.
So I frequently have relatives say, so why do we still have the electoral college? So why do we still have the electoral college, other than it's really hard to change the Constitution? I get that, but are there any justifications left?
Well,
Go ahead, Steve.
no, go ahead, Ann. From a standpoint of, sort of democratic theory, I think it's pretty hard, for me anyway, to justify the electoral college. But I know that from a narrower parochial standpoint, independent of the constitutional structure, which is nigh on impossible to change, independent of that, there are still lots of particular parts of the country who are benefited by it and who wouldn't want to change it. So
Yeah, I'm thinking the state interests, I was going to say something really similar to Steve, the state interests that would make it hard to change the Constitution would be the interests that kind of militate against making the change away from the Electoral College. I know, Tony, you've mentioned sort of the state of Iowa, right, as having a strong interest in not doing away with the Electoral College, because it ensures representation, for smaller states in the national decision-making process, in the national conversation.
And what's so interesting about that is having spent some time in Iowa this fall, well, I've been in Ohio the vast majority of the time, there was virtually no presidential advertising in Iowa this fall, whereas in all the 7 battleground states, there's a tremendous amount of advertising. And so while I think the Iowa congressional delegation would be adamantly opposed to abolishing the Electoral College. The voters of Iowa would be, the Iowa legislature would certainly not, I think, at least right now, vote to amend the Electoral College. You do have to ask, what is the actual benefit to Iowa, to Nebraska, to South Dakota and other low population states of the Electoral College when we're not really participating at all in the presidential races? And if Iowa had become a purple state, we would. So ultimately, it really seems to matter. Not really. It really only matters whether you're a battleground state when it comes to getting attention from the presidential candidates. And that seems to me to be an argument for small states being more, they should be more open-minded about revisiting the usefulness or lack thereof of the Electoral College in the 21st century.
And if it's suppressing voter participation to continue it, then even the argument from those not the states that are not focused on the non-swing states to say, well, but it's how we keep somebody paying attention to us somehow. If nobody's voting there, because anyhow, I having a hard time explaining to my relatives why it still merits defense.
Yeah, well, to me, I'm not sure that it's your job to justify it to your relatives. It's instead to explain how difficult it is to amend the Constitution.
Yeah.
I do wonder, the Electoral College, the debate over the Electoral College, it seems to me, since 2000, when Gore won the nationwide popular vote by 500,000 and Bush got to 271 in the Electoral College and won the presidency, that since then, it seems like the issue has been framed as one in which Democrats would benefit from getting, not by election law scholars, but sort of by the general public and the media, that the Electoral College is hurting Democrats. Democrats would be better to get rid of it, and Republicans are the beneficiaries of the Electoral College, and it's an anti-democratic thing. But the Republicans won the nationwide popular vote in the U.S. House in 2022 by about 3 million. They're going to win the nationwide vote for U.S. House this year. Last time I checked, they're up by about 5 million. Trump's going to win the nationwide popular vote. It might end up being a little less than 3 million, but he's going to win it. The Republicans now are showing they can do pretty darn well in national popular votes. So maybe the Republican Party going forward may be more receptive to the idea of revisiting this. And there have even been, if you look at demographic trends, it's possible that Democrats will end up being beneficiaries of the Electoral College when states like Montana, which have seen a significant influx of blue voters from California, Idaho's starting to see it now in the Boise area. It's conceivable with population shifts that a decade from now, the Democrats might actually have an Electoral College advantage over the Republicans. So maybe the Republicans would be smart to advocate reform right now before the Democrats have a strong incentive to oppose it themselves.
Yeah, that long-term strategy is always interesting. This notion that we can accomplish certain reforms if we are still enough removed from the effective date that no one really knows who's going to benefit from the reform down the road. But even this election in the weeks prior to it, I think in one of our previous podcasts, we mentioned the possibility that this election was suggesting the possibility that Trump could win the popular vote and Harris could win the Electoral College vote, the reversal of what happened in 2000, as you described. And that was because there were already some indicators that in a number of non-battleground states, Republicans were likely to do better than they had historically. In California, New York, for instance, that Republicans might, although not win the state, still have a larger share. And that maybe if Harris narrowly won enough of the swing states to win the Electoral College, there might still be more total popular vote for Trump. Now, in fact, what ended up happening was that shift towards Republican voters this election occurred all over the place. And you can look at those maps with the red arrows versus blue arrows and see that in ways that meant Harris just couldn't eke out an electoral college victory, and so lost the electoral college, and Trump won that and the popular vote. But yes, you're right. It may be that historic advantage for the Republican Party recently is now kind of, or is ephemeral. We'll see. But there's one more thing though that has stood out to me in terms of turnout, which is, as I was looking at these turnout numbers for this year so far, which again is yet to be finally counted, but compared to 2020 and 2016, going back for a while, you can really see a bit of a bump in turnout, a bump up in turnout from 2000 on compared to the last couple decades of the 20th century. And, you know, maybe compared to what those of us in the field of elections would wish of our citizens, that more participate yet. Nonetheless, it was noticeable to see the increase was pretty persistent for the last couple decades compared to earlier. Again, those turnout numbers, I think it would behoove all of us in the field to keep working to generate more citizen interest in democracy. I think, you know, democracy is a good thing, and something I wanted to be able to talk about a little bit more today is the relative smoothness of this election, and what I hope is a bit of a reversion to the mean as well in terms of the public's confidence in the election or acceptance of the outcome. And it's gratifying to not be having to spend a lot of my time trying to reassure people that the mechanics of the election are reliable. But that's all still related to this broader point about the value of democracy and the hope that people will both have trust and faith in it and be participatory.
Well, one thing I would add about that point, Steve, is that another feature of the 2024 election that it should be a source of optimism is that it was the least racially polarized election we've seen in decades. And that would suggest now that both parties are very incentivized to campaign in basically what used to be the other party's turf, that Republicans made major gains with Latino voters. They made major gains with Asian voters. They even made noticeable gains with African-American voters. African-American voters have historically voted as much as 90 to 95% for the Democrats. Trump appears in many of the biggest cities in the United States in African-American precincts. He won about 20% of the vote. So all that goes to say the Republicans now have a real incentive to campaign in diverse districts, diverse parts of the country, and the Democrats have had real success in the suburbs. And so I think there's grounds for cautious optimism that both parties now forced to campaign everywhere, that could end up driving up turnout more in the future because neither party can really afford to take their voters for granted.
And Tony, were you going to say something just about, you know, the relative turnout of the last 2 decades compared to the previous couple of decades when your mic was cutting out?
Yes. So Steve, you're absolutely right. Turnout in 2020 was at a record level. Turnout in 2024, though lower than 2020, is still one of the highest turnout elections of the last 50 years. In the late 20th century, it was very common for turnout to only barely be around 50%. So the fact that we now are consistently above 60% in terms of turnout is something that's both very positive and an indicator that this is an era where the electorate's more engaged than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think that's something to welcome.
But Tony, earlier you had said that what you're describing is most true for the swing states. So are the non-swing states back to that early, the earlier version, and it's just the swing states, or does turnout really up everywhere? It's just more up in the swings.
Yeah, certainly, Terry. Turnout is up across the country compared to the 1980s and 1990s. Even the lowest turnout state still saw a significant overall increase in turnout from 20 plus years ago. It's just between 2020 and 2024, we saw a decline in turnout in over 40 states. We saw an increase in turnout in the 7 battleground states. So it's clear that the Electoral College is really driving turnout in the battleground states. It is depressing turnout in the non-battleground states, but they still are seeing a remarkably high level of turnout, which in and of itself is interesting because it shows that voters do want to express their preference, even when they know their state is not at issue. Their state is clearly going to be a blue state or a red state. And I think that's a hopeful sign as well. And of course, they also have down ballot races to vote for. But big picture, turnout across the board is much higher than what we saw in the late 20th century.
So let me just ask the two of you, and I know we lost Anne, she had another commitment, but if you have any other reflections on the relative smoothness of this election, or lessons to be learned from this election.
It's a little bit hard for me to talk about smoothness. I mean, day of, yes, there was a good bit of smoothness. There were not a lot of, issues that would have led to litigation. I mean, we just didn't see a lot of, there are glitches here and there, but there wasn't a lot. But I do wonder, had the Electoral College vote gone the other way, would we be saying the same thing? Or is it that there was just a difference in the response of the candidates and their parties to winning and losing?
I would also add that while certainly the period up to the election and election day went really smoothly, with the caveat that Terry added, which I think is a really important one. If we had had another election like 2020 that was razor thin in the Electoral College, we may have seen a focus on problems that ultimately were irrelevant in this election cycle. But one concern I have is California. California is still counting. They're not the only state that hasn't completed their count. There are a number of other states where, as I said, we're at 150 million votes counted so far. There's 6 to 7 million still to be counted. The lion's share of that 6 to 7 million is in California. And if we are in an era now where the Republicans are going to be competing in more diverse states where you're not going to be able to predict 8 years out what will be the battleground states, California may end up being a battleground state one day. And California takes weeks to count. And again, it's got 40 million people. It's the biggest state in terms of population. At a certain level, it's understandable. But on the other hand, big states like Texas have been much quicker when it comes to counting their votes. I do think we could potentially have a California problem down the road if we had an election in which California was a swing state, California's result was in doubt, and California is still counting votes in early December. That would be a very significant problem. And so the good news is I think California's got lots of time to address this, but it is something that I think California is going to need to address in the next few years.
So I do think that, even without regard to which candidate won or lost, that we saw fewer attacks on the mechanics of the system, even on election day, than we thought we might. And that in particular, election observers, generally speaking, performed what was the legitimate election observer role, rather than perhaps engaging in conduct that might have been more disruptive. And there was, some reason to not be entirely sure how smoothly those dimensions of the process would go. I know from the standpoint of the election administration community that there were real worries about poll worker harassment. And, we can find scattered anecdotes of problems that individual poll workers had with particular voters, even before election day, but they were pretty isolated. So all of that I found reassuring, and I do think that, you know, the role of being a poll worker or an election official continues to be a demanding role, and that whatever we can do to make those roles desirable for people to take on and to then perform them smoothly is worth doing. But Tony, your point about, you know, California right now not being an issue because it's not a swing state raises with me the more general point that, you know, the fact that we don't have problems is no reason to abandon the attention to our system and make sure that we are continuing to keep it robust, and where there's room for improvement to make them. Now, I say that with a real degree of caution, or with a caveat, which is I don't think states should be willy-nilly changing their election law just to change their election law. That's really disruptive. The election administration community really benefits from and deserves to have some stability or continuity. We don't want to be changing things all the time. And so I'd like to think that we wouldn't be promoting dramatic changes, but that instead states might just be attuned to where there are improvements they could make carefully that aren't disruptive.
Well, yeah, I would like those improvements to be based on something. Like, first, status quo should be what stays unless you've identified a problem and that your fix is something that's going to fix the problem. I mean, I think about that with states that are removing, ballot boxes, external boxes, where you can go place your ballot. I think before you take those away, you need to identify what is a problem that you're solving by taking them away, rather than sort of a more abstract conceptual determination that there could be a problem here. Here's what I can think up this problem. I just fear change for change's sake without having a reason.
Well, and so figuring out how to count ballots faster, as Tony was suggesting, I think might always be worthwhile.
And I think the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022 is one of the great successes of this cycle. It fell between the 2020 and 2024 elections, but it was a response to what was obviously a very real problem that had been around for a long time and had never been addressed. It took a crisis to prompt action. Fortunately, the ECRA's provisions aren't going to be critically important in making sure we've got a smooth transition of power this year. But it is good to see that the Congress was able to address a big problem that needed to be addressed, even in a time of polarization. And because of the changing nature of the two parties' political coalitions, I think there is reason for optimism that other problems that had been in the system for a while that couldn't get fixed because of polarization might now be more in play, that both sides might be more receptive to sensible reforms that don't have a partisan angle, because now that both parties have to compete more broadly for voters, both parties have an incentive in it. So I come away from this election with a more hopeful view of the future of our democratic institutions, regardless of the outcome of the election, just in terms of how the Republicans had to win, and how smoothly the election went. Those two things, the fact that Republicans have to compete now and are successfully competing for a more diverse coalition of voters, and the fact that the election system overall performed incredibly well under extreme strain. Those two things make me more hopeful than I would have been a few years ago.
Well, so you mentioned Congress's role, and you talked about democratic institutions. Maybe I can shift the conversation to one additional topic that those comments reminded me of. And that is that today we've learned that the Senate Republicans have chosen John Thune to be the Senate Majority Leader. And, that's an important step in the congressional leadership structure. And that, I think, was seen today as a reflection that the Senate Republicans continue to be supportive of an institutionalist. That's how John Thune is often described, along the lines of a Mitch McConnell with a lot of experience in the Senate. And that was in contrast to the possibility that the Senate Republicans might have chosen as their leader somebody who was less of an institutionalist, less committed to some of the norms of the Senate as an institution. And, I'm sort of curious if either of you had any reaction to that choice today, but I'll also say in connection with this that I think our podcast going forward is likely to want to talk on many occasions about some of these broader questions about the role of legal institutions and political institutions has focused on election law stuff in the run-up to the 2024 election, but there are a lot of other elements of the way in which our democratic institutions and processes function that we're eager to talk about and to continue to reflect upon and think about what the role of law is in promoting democratic processes. So with that as a kind of a transition note, the Senate has picked its new majority leader.
And I think you could say Kamala Harris is going to play an institutional role as well, Steve, in January as the vice president who will be receiving the certificates of ascertainment from the states. And she will be presiding over a peaceful transfer of power in an election she lost. This is a fairly rare thing in our history for an incumbent vice president to get the party's nomination and then lose. We saw with Al Gore in 2001. He lost 2000 race in 2001. He presided over the electoral count. We also saw it Thomas Jefferson in 1797 when he lost to John Adams. It's a rare event, but it's really, in a lot of ways, the most powerful and really inspiring event because it's the losing candidate who is formally acknowledging the victorious candidate. And after the disgraceful events of January 6, 2021, I think the country needs to see the events of January 6, 2025 as the way things are supposed to be done. And losing a presidential race has to be a crushing experience, but she really does get to make a contribution to her country on January 6th. And I have every expectation she will comport herself with aplomb and with tremendous dignity. And that's something that I think every American, regardless how you voted in November, should be impressed by and proud of the conduct of our vice president on this upcoming January 6th, because I think she will be a source of pride, should be, for every American.
What the election this morning of Thune made me think about is secret ballots. That voting is done with a secret ballot, and so much else of what we do politically is in the open. But the fact that leadership, like presidential election, right? Everybody goes in there and casts their ballot in secret, and leadership vote that same way. It just struck me as that's what worked to get somebody who's an institutionalist into that role. I think had it been like, raise your hand and say who you want, it might have had a different outcome.
Oh, that's a really interesting thing to think about. And, within representative institutions, we generally expect the representatives to have to vote publicly because their constituents are entitled to know how they voted. So here we have a process in which the constituents are not privy to how each of the senators have voted with respect to their institutional leader. Now, of course, that's a different question than voting on what the laws will be that are going to directly affect the constituents. So, just as a matter of the internal operation of the Senate, senators have chosen a process that allows each senator to vote by secret ballot for their majority leader. But it is interesting to wonder how different that may allow the process to be. So thanks for that. Tony,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to agree, Terry. I think that's a hugely important point. I hadn't thought about it either. And it does, it shows how, although democracy has to be transparent at a certain level, a certain degree of space for the leadership can also make it possible to achieve things that might not be achievable if you have complete transparency. And that's kind of the challenge in law and democracy is we've got our principles of transparency, but then to get things done requires a certain degree of pragmatism that might need to happen off camera. I think that's a great point you made about Thune.
And Tony, I was going to say, didn't you just sort of undermine yourself by giving away what could have been a good trivia question? You could have saved as a trivia question, how many vice presidents have presided over the electoral counting when they were the candidate? But I'm using that as a segue to say, Tony, give us our trivia question answer from last week and our new trivia question.
Absolutely, Steve. So our trivia question for last week was, how many times in the last 100 years has the victorious presidential ticket not featured an attorney on the ticket? It's either the presidential candidate or the vice presidential candidate. How many times in the last 100 years? And the answer is 4. Since 1924, only 4 times has the winning presidential ticket not had a lawyer somewhere on that ticket. The 4 times were Bush, or I should say there were 4 tickets. It actually happened a total of 6 times because twice the tickets won both times. Bush Cheney, George Bush Jr., George Walker Bush, and Dick Cheney, neither were attorneys. They won in 2000, 2004. Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, they won in 1884. And then Lyndon Baines Johnson and Hubert Humphrey in 1964, and John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson in 60. None of them are lawyers. However, there is a little bit of an asterisk there. LBJ went to night school at Georgetown Law School for a semester while he was in Congress. He didn't finish, he wasn't a lawyer, so we'll put him in this list of 4 tickets. But that's the answer to last week's trivia question, 4 times in the last 100 years.
Thank you.
And our trivia question for next week is related, and that is, how many times in the last 100 years has the victorious presidential ticket featured 2 lawyers? Both the president and the vice president were lawyers. And it's happened more often than you might think.
Very good. Well, so start searching your archives and your memory and pull together an answer to that one, and we'll give it to you in our next episode. And I will look forward to being with each of you and other members of our team and others we may be able to invite to participate. And again, we continue to look forward to thinking even more broadly about law and democracy now that the election itself is over for this cycle. Well, Tony and Terry and Ann, who already had to go, thanks for being with us today, and we'll see you next time.